I think, yeah. Now we are getting recorded. So a very good evening to our dear students and a very good evening to our resource person for the evening, Dr. Debjani Sengupta, Associate Professor, Indraprastha College for Women, University of Delhi. Good evening, Debjani Di. And let me first thank you on behalf of our department for accepting our invitation and giving us time from your schedule. Well, as per the convention that we follow, I should formally introduce Devjanidhi. But let me be a little candid about this. If you just Google her name, you will get plenty of information on her research interests and her achievements, academic achievements. But I can't resist mentioning the fact that I don't know if Devjanidhi has already noticed this, but the list of recommended books by University of Gorbongo, that includes a volume that has been edited by Debjani. So that white colored book with some, silhouette-like image of the barbed wire, partition literature by Worldview, excellent volume by Mr. Sachin Rastogi. That has been wonderfully edited by Debjanidhi, and it's a really special moment. I think. I mean, when I was a student, I used to always keep thinking if I could have an interaction with the person who had edited this book. So we tried to give you people that moment. So as I repeat, the book that you use as partition literature, that is edited by our resource person for the evening. So she will be speaking on what has been one of her areas of interest, that is partition literature. And I feel that it's very significant that we will be discussing partition literature sitting in Malda, one of the regions in India which was very significantly affected by partition, and probably it is still affected. Right. So without further ado, I hand over the platform to Debjanidhi. I will mute myself and turn off my camera. And I think our students know the drill, but I just still remind, keep your cams and microphones switched off. And please feel free to leave your comments and questions in the chat box. So over to you, Debjanidhi.
Thank you, Debaditto. It is a great pleasure to speak to the students of the English department, Gorbongo University. And I am just delighted to be invited to speak to you today. I'll just very briefly tell you the structure in which I'm going to sort of present my topic today. That is, in the first 5-6 minutes, I will be talking a little bit and give you a little bit of the background and some of the issues which come up when we study the partition of India. And then I'm going to talk very briefly for a minute or two about why partitions literature is important. And after that, Debaditto has very kindly shared your syllabus. So I will discuss 3 stories that you have in your syllabus. That is Manto's Tobatexing, Dibendu Palit's Alamer Nijer Bari, Alam's Own House, and Manik Bandyopadhyay's Final Solution, which is in Bangla, it is called Upay. So I will discuss these 3 stories simply to give you an idea about how, texts or narratives also become a way in which we can understand and enter the partition. I'm absolutely okay with if you have any questions when I'm talking, and you can just raise your, there is this hand raising thing, you can do that. But I prefer seeing your face. If you are asking me a question, then please put on your camera, and I would like to see who is speaking to me, because I hate disembodied voices. Okay. So let me begin by talking about the partition. Now, the Second World War and the years immediately after the World War is a very, very important moment in the subcontinent's history. We have had a huge famine, the Bengal famine in 1943. Then the war had taken a huge toll in terms of the pauperization of the population. The food prices have gone up. The war, and especially the British war effort, also meant that huge amounts of productive people and labor were also getting shipped outside. So all these different kinds of events actually culminated in a sense in 1945, when the Labour won the British election, and Prime Minister Attlee decided, unlike the Conservative government before him, that India could no longer be, continue to be a British empire. And the time had come for, to do something else. So a transfer of power was thought to be, a very important way in which the British could actually leave India. And Lord Wavell, who was the Governor General at that time, decided to sort of implement what is called the Cabinet Mission Plan in May 1946 to discuss the modalities in which this transfer of power will happen. But of course, all the players, all the political parties were called, primarily the Congress and the Muslim League. And this tripartite meeting between the British, the Congress, and the Muslim League began. It began and sort of began very swiftly. So if you look at the time span of the cabinet mission, and very soon it failed, because by that time in 46, you already have what I would say are pre-partition violences. That is, the communal internecine violences have begun in many parts of British India. And the British role of becoming arbiters in this kind of negotiation failed very miserably because of a number of reasons. I don't want to go into them, but primarily because the Congress and the Muslim League did not agree to many of the provisions of the plan. So the dialogue that everybody was thinking would happen did not happen. The dialogue failed, and what happened was that, and what is surprising is that in spite of the failure of this dialogue, none of the players who were part of this tripartite talk actually envisaged or realized what actually was going to take place once the British left India, or once the British announced their plans to leave India. So it was so in many ways it's very strange that the three parties began to talk, but also began to, at that time, also began to realize that the only way they could transfer this power was to actually accept the idea of a partition. that, and the partition would, of course, be on religious identity. So, the historic decision to divide the country was taken and was accepted by all the three players. But it is very strange that none of them actually realized or anticipated the carnage that was to take place. And that really surprises me, every time I think about it. So the looting, the killing, the homelessness of hundreds and thousands of people, the abductions of women, the murder, the mayhem, all of that, which began in all the main cities of British India, starting from Lahore, Karachi, Peshawar, and then on to Amritsar, Delhi, and then down to Bihar, and to Dhaka, to Calcutta. Calcutta, of course, had the great Calcutta killing, August 1946. And then, of course, Noakhali happens. So, the systematic communal violence takes place right from the time the announcement is made that the British are going to have decided to leave India. So what does partition mean, actually? So if you begin to think about it, then the partition results not only in a division of the geographical space of British India, and if you think of the map of British India stretching from the northwest frontier provinces, Afghanistan, and to Burma, it's a huge landmass. And so this huge geographical space is divided. But it is also a creation of spaces, and this is a very important point which I want to come back to when I discuss the stories, the whole idea of borders and borderlands become new entities of political thought. So it is in one fell swoop. You have a division of people, you have a division of shared history, of culture, of languages, memories of communities, of homes, and geographical spaces. So the nationalist historical account of what partition meant, Nehru's very famous speech, for instance, Our Tryst with Destiny, that very famous speech actually does not take into account that this long cherished freedom, that India will become free, actually comes accompanied by tremendous amount of tragic communal violence. And so this creation of the new nations, India and Pakistan, the creation of new borders, the creation of borderlands, suddenly create these new categories of citizens and aliens. So if you're within the border, then you are the citizens. If you're living outside the border, you become aliens. So it's just overnight, these changes happen. So, and of course, when I'm talking about people crossing the borders of these newly made boundaries, these are millions. You have seen, I'm sure you have seen pictures of the kafilas, or the long trains filled with refugees, or people walking miles, carrying their belongings, carrying their children. So millions of people are actually, it's now considered to be, historians are absolutely clear, this is the largest human migration known in history. So millions of people cross the freshly defined boundaries. And I'm just going to give you one tiny statistics just to show you how these humongous numbers we are talking about. Only by 1960, 30 million people enter West Bengal by 1960 alone. And 30 lakh Hindu refugees come in, and 7 lakh Muslims leave West Bengal to go to East Pakistan. This is just till 1960. And the count of people who have died in violence, whether they are Christians or Sikhs or Muslims or Hindus, the count is sometime, this is the official count. I personally think it would be much higher. It is 1 million people. And 80,000 people, 80,000 women face abduction and sexual assault. So these are huge numbers, I mean, these are not just these are not just tiny statistics. These are huge numbers. These are people. So the question is that if such a terrible trauma in such a large scale has taken place, how is it that we have never had any public memorialization or public memorial, to commemorate the dead or commemorate this suffering? How come we have never spoken of the partition in a way as a national tragedy or as something of our history that we need to know? And this, I think, has changed only in the 1980s and 90s, with certain people coming up with different ways in which we can talk about the partition and look at it. And I'm just going to read 2 lines from Ashish Nandi. He's a cultural commentator and, of course, sociologist. And he says, like a disowned, and I'm quoting him, like a disowned self dogging the steps of a patient who cannot yet own up to his or her illness, the past traumata of a collective also haunt victims and perpetrators and follow generations. So he says, unlike an unexamined life, which we are told is not worth living, and an unexamined past is also something which lives out through succeeding generations' trauma. So this is one of the things, because we have never publicly acknowledged or talked about what the partition has done to us as a people, it has continued to live amongst us. It has continued to fester. That wound has remained. And many of you, and Debadito rightly said that, many of you, because you are situated in a certain area, a site, a geographical locality, which is extremely it's close to the border. It has historically been a site of migrations because of geographical and agricultural reasons. You will know that, and you will probably also know in your own family, that there are lots of these partition events which people have kept bottled up. And this sort of began to come out through Urvashi Butalia's book, The Other Side of Silence. I'm sure you have looked at it, and I'm not going to talk about it in detail. But one of the things, therefore, Butalia's book really pinpoints is that if there is a national history about how India has got freedom and how we became free and how Azadi came and etc., etc. There has not been a social history of the partition. There haven't been a feminist history of the partition. What happened to people? What happened to children? What happened to Dalits? What happened to Muslims who stayed back? What happened to women who were abducted and then later released like prisoners to their original family? So we don't know their stories. And it was Butalia's oral history which began to actually unearth these hidden histories of the partition. And it began to, bring to light many of these, what I would call, Wazira Zamindar calls the long shadow of the partition. So the partition is not something that is an event which is finished, which has happened in 47 and we have nothing to do with it. So one of the reasons which I think as students, you are confronted with, and probably some of you will or have already confronted it, is that why should we read something which has happened 77 years ago? Well, how does it matter to us? We have to carry on, we have to live, we have to go forward. But, if you think about what Ashish Nandi says, that if we don't know our past, we are condemned to making the same mistakes and repeating the same mistakes again and again. And I think that is the reason why, as a teacher and as a scholar, I am very interested in the partition, because the partition actually enables me to understand my society in a way which is very important for me, as a citizen, as a teacher, as an academic. So let me introduce then this idea that the partition is not just one event which has finished and which has been done away with. It's not. It's a long durée. It's something which continues, and shadows so many of our relationships, so many of our spaces, so many of our responses, and the way in which it has shadowed our present life in the subcontinent is something that I'm sure all of you know and realize it. Also because, in many geographical areas away from the metropolitan centers, the way partition actually plays out in border disputes, or in the idea of who is a citizen and who is an alien, or enclaves in Malda and nearby areas, till very recent past, they were enclaves, that is, portions of Bangladesh's territory within India and portions of Indian territory within Bangladesh. So one of the reasons then we need to study partition is because not only, as Butalia says, there is a paucity of social histories and feminist historiography, but we also have to know about the unfinished agenda of nation building. So the whole idea of what this nation that came into being in 1947, how is it to be built up, and and how is it to be created, and how is it to be formulated? All these ideas then become very important when we think of the partition and the moment of the partition. And one of the important ways in which we can actually enter this history which is forgotten, this history which nobody talks about any longer, is the participation of minorities, the participation of women and children, the participation and the affective responses, the emotional responses of people, the Dalits, the scheduled castes. Shekhar Bandopadhyay has worked extensively on this, and I'm not going to um, spend too much time. But the point which I need to make is that when you look at all this new work which has happened on the partition, you will realize that there is a plurality. There are many ways in which people remember the partition. So it is not just one way in which people remember the partition. People remember the partition in many different ways. So there is a kind of plurality of memories, or there are also pluralities of how we have forgotten it. So it's not only just what we remember, but also what we have forgotten. And at this plurality of memories, you will see in the same community. It is not, and so it is variegated. It changes from community, from caste, from gender, from religion. The optics, all these optics actually change the way in which people remember or forget the partition. And one of the ways, and which is now I'm going to come to that second section, the ways in which why I think literatures of the partition are very important, because I think narratives and literary narratives actually is a new resource, is a new archive with which we can remember and see what has happened in the partition. And historians now take representations and literary representations very seriously, because memory, and this is of course the new, the now buzzword in partition studies is memory studies, and the way in which memories are constructed, and just as a literature, just as a literary text is constructed, memories are also constructed. So this constant negotiation between words and memory are very important and very interesting for us to see and realize when we are reading partition literature. So memory is, of course, deeply implicated in imagination. No, you use imagination when you remember something, because you can't remember everything. So sometimes you fill in the gaps by, imagining something. So it's not that we are lying to ourselves. It's just the way memory works. Memory works by, filling in the gaps, which we don't always remember. So an engagement with the literary archive then becomes very, very important, and a significant way in which all these narratives about people living in different locations, living in different, under different circumstances, these narratives can then enable us to understand the way partition has been remembered by different kinds of people. And I think that is a very, very important resource for all of us, not only for scholars and academics, but also for students. So I'm delighted, that you are reading a whole paper on the partition. When I was a student, it was unthinkable. We never spoke about the partition, except inside homes, and we read it in the history books, but this was a kind of nationalist high history, which was written, for general consumption. But things have changed. From the 80s and 90s, things have changed, and I think for the better. So let me now turn to some of the stories that you read. Debaditya, I'm okay for time?
Absolutely,
Okay,
absolutely.
all right.
Please take your time.
Yeah, okay. So I'll talk a little bit about the three stories that you have in your. Let me take out Manto, because otherwise, I will need to. Just give me a minute, please. So, for instance, if you look at Manto's story, Toba Tek Singh, Manto's story is, of course, about division. The story takes place, you have all read the stories. Are you familiar with the stories? All of you?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, wonderful. Because, I don't want to talk about something which you are unfamiliar with. And what about the other two stories? Manik Bandyopadhyay and Dibendu Palit? You are familiar with the stories?
Ma'am, I read the Manik Bandyopadhyay.
Not the Dibendu Palit?
Not yet, ma'am.
Okay. So what
Actually,
you do is,
Debjani, the thing is, ওদের এক্সামটা জাস্ট শেষ হয়েছে তো, মানে দে আর জাস্ট ট্রাইং
ঠিক
টু
আছে,
ক্যাচ।
নো প্রবলেম। আমি তাহলে আলামের বাড়ি, নিজের বাড়িটা না একটু গল্পটা বলে দেব, so that you can understand what are the points I'm trying to
That
make.
would be fantastic.
Yeah.
That would be great.
Yeah. So in Toba Tek Singh, the story takes place in a mental asylum. And the mental asylum is full of people. Christians and Sikhs and Hindus and Muslims. And it's in a sense a microcosm of the larger nation. It's a small miniature formula, a model, so to say. It's a small miniature model of the larger nation, where people of different religions live together. And this asylum is confronted with the question, when the Batwara takes place, when the division takes place, these asylum inmates are confronted with the question, where is Hindustan and where is Pakistan? Because they are completely confused. So what Manto does, and very cleverly, is actually to spatially represent the Batwara. The Batwara which is happening in the real world is being spatially represented through the story. First, through the asylum, and next, through the no man's land, where Toba Tek Singh is found. So the spatial component of the story, the actual division, which is happening elsewhere, and how Radcliffe drew the boundaries. Cyril Radcliffe was was a government servant who had no clue about. So he took a map and just drew lines. These are going to be this is going to be Pakistan, this is going to be East Pakistan, West Pakistan, this is going to be India. So he had no idea where the lines were running. Whether they were, in the eastern sector, for instance, the lines ran through the middle of the river, or the lines ran through the middle of a village. So half the village was in India and the other half was in East Pakistan. So it was an absolutely absurd situation. This absurdity of the Batwara is actually seen in the sanity. The opposite of this absurdity is the sanity of the questions that the supposed madmen ask. But where is Pakistan? And where is Hindustan? You see? So the question of the spatial organization, the organization of the spaces, the boundaries, the borderlands, which did not exist and which now exist. So the absurdity of that is represented through these fantastic questions that the madmen come up with. And you remember that madman who goes up onto the tree and says, I'm not going to come down. You know, this is a mad world. So the insanity that has put these people in the asylum actually is a form of sanity. So what Manto is depicting is a complete topsy-turvy way in which reality has been played around with. So what we thought was real, like Toba Singh thinks his village is real. To him, that is real. That is where he lived. That is where he had his family. That is where his cows were there. That is where his agricultural land was there. But suddenly that reality becomes unreal because it suddenly is no longer in India. Nobody knows where it is. Is it in India? Is it in Pakistan? So there is a complete reversal of what you think is real. But this reversal, this absurdity, is actually represented through this spatiality in the story. You understand spatiality? That is the way in which a certain space is organized. So the spatiality of the asylum and the spatiality, spatiality, space, from the word space. So the spatiality of the asylum and the spatiality of the no man's land, where Toba Singh stands and says, I refuse to move, is a very important trope. It's a very important image of the story. But this space, these plethora of spaces, it is not just one space, but there are some absent spaces also, like the village Toba Singh, where he actually belongs. So the absent space, the present space, and the future space, the no man's land. All three spaces come together and sort of mingle with each other in the story. It's a fabulous story, you know. It's one of the reasons is that it's a very complex story. It is not just, you know, it's a linear narrative. It's not a linear narrative. There are ways in which the narrative is constantly self-reflecting on itself. So you think you are reading a story about the asylum and the madmen, but actually the story is not about the asylum. The story is about Batwara. The story is about belonging. The story is about refusing to belong to a country which divides people because of their religion. Is that clear? I mean, I can, you know, go on and on, but let me go to the next two stories, because this question of space is very important. And it is very important, particularly when we are looking at Alam and Nijer Bari. You know, in this story, Alam's own house, you know, it's a very simple story. And it's really one of my favorite story of all times. I have translated it myself and I just love this story. It's a very simple and a very interesting story because it's a story about memory. How does memory work? Alam is a young Muslim boy who was born in Calcutta. And when the partition riots take place, he is, of course, a young boy at that time, but his father, who's a doctor, he decides to exchange his property with a Hindu family who has come from the other side. And this was a very common thing which happened during the partition years. You know, people would exchange properties. So this Hindu family comes to live in his house in Park Circus, and his father and his family goes to live in Dhaka. Now, because Alam is a young boy and he has exams, his father decides to leave him back in Kolkata. So he continues to live in that house, the house where he was born, with that Hindu family. So you see how space is again very interestingly used. So this house is something which gives him his identity. You know, he belongs to this house, and this house, in a sense, is where his growing up years has happened. Now, many years later, after he finishes his exams and all, he, of course, goes back to his own family in Dhaka. And the story takes place, the story opens with his return to Calcutta after 71. Bangladesh has happened. The partition, the lessons of partition has been overturned by Bangladesh's rise. Bangladesh does not come into being because of religious nationalism. It comes into being through linguistic nationalism. And he is coming back to Kolkata on a seminar, and he hopes to meet Raka, the girl with whom he the girl of that Hindu family who had taken his house and whom he knew because he was also living in that house. And he hopes to meet Raka. It is, of course, not made clear in the story. And that's one of the reasons why I love the story. It's a story of great subtlety. You know, it's a very subtle language which has been used. He hopes to meet Raka because of some unfinished business. We don't know what that unfinished business is, but he wants to meet her, and he wants to ask her or decide on something. So he comes back to Kolkata, and he meets Raka's parents, who are, of course, it's his own house, but now, of course, owned by this Hindu family. And he, of course, comes to stay there. And he meets Raka's parents, but Raka is not there. So in a sense, this story is a kind of unfinished story. But I'm going to read a little bit about space and memory. And just a little bit where he talks about the house. And he says, please give me a moment. Alam is in a taxi coming from Dom Dom Airport, and he's going to Park Circus, where his old house is. And this is what I'm reading, my own translation. You have some other translation, but please allow me to read my own translation because it's a very subtle story, and I need to sort of hear something which I'm familiar with. I'm reading the story. Alam had asked the driver to move slowly so that he could direct him. Now right, now left. His eyes looked for familiar sights and found only novelty. This single-story house had sprouted another floor. That flowering garden was almost obliterated by the rudeness of a motor garage, while a new signboard proclaimed how expendable the old one was. But he had no trouble recognizing his old house. There never would be. I'm the only person who has been born in the same house twice, Alam had once told Raka. At least that was what he had thought then. So the house is just not a house. The house has many layers of memories to it. And as he goes towards the house, as he recognizes the Kathali Chapa tree next to the gate, he also remembers in his mind his own parents, the day they left the house, and the day the other family came in. And the house which has enveloped all these lives, and how this house has become a kind of recipient of memory. It has created memory, but it also receives memory. And in that way, you can now understand the title of the story, Alam's own house. It is not a house which he has left ever, because in his mind, he keeps on coming back to it again and again and again. It is the house which has given him his identity. It is the house where he was born twice. Now, it is of course not explained, but probably he fell in love with Raka. And that was why his second birth. And then, he says, the car stopped abruptly and Alam exhaled the air he had kept locked in his chest. Suitcase in hand, he stepped out of the car. But before he let the driver go, he wanted to make sure the house was the same. He asked himself if there was any reason for doubt. He could clearly see the marble nameplate on the wall next to the small gate, Anantashekar Shannal. You see the erasure? The Muslim name has been erased and the Hindu name has been put in. Within a month of Baba's departure, the old nameplate had been removed. It was necessary, as patients often came knocking at the door, refusing to believe that Dr. Shahib had left the country forever. Without sentimentality, Alam had suggested it himself. No, it wasn't that. He didn't recognize the house because the Katalech Chapa tree had vanished. In its place stood a concrete structure, a sweet shop called Modhur. The house used to be instantly recognizable. People knew it as a house with the Kathali Chapa tree. Perhaps they now know it by the name of the shop. Raka never wrote about these changes. Surely there was a reason. So you see here, in this very small passage which I read, because you're not familiar with the story, I'm reading this passage because you can then understand what I'm subsequently going to say. You can see here a kind of erasure of the space where at one time one community lived. And that community has now been slowly erased, while another community has come to take its place. And this erasure in the city where this community had lived for generations. This house was built by Alam's grandfather. And this house has very historical significance because when Gandhi came to Calcutta, he had a prayer meeting in their terrace. So those moments of history have also been erased. Those moments of history and the history that is connected with a particular community have also been erased. So when Alam comes now into the house, it is a space which has been sanitized. It is a space which is no longer the space that Calcutta was at one time. Calcutta is now a homogeneous space, where people of a minority community live in ghettos. And the community, the majority community lives in the obvious spaces. And there is a very beautiful essay by Jaya Chatterjee on the vanishing graveyards of Calcutta, the Muslim graveyards of Calcutta. How traces are actually removed from the city. As the community is pushed out of the city, these traces also vanish. So memory is not just about concrete structures. Memory is also about events, about people. He remembers his father sitting on the veranda having his last meal before he leaves the house to cross the border. So in a very interesting way, this story is also about time. It is about temporality. And in the story, why I love the story is because the story is, although it begins in a linear fashion, he comes to Calcutta, he gets off the aeroplane, he gets into a cab, then he goes to the house, he meets Raka's parents. Although there is this linear narrative there is constantly a break in that linear narrative because he is constantly going back in time. So the story is about space, but it is also about memory and temporality. It is about time and the way we understand time. And the way time also works on us. Because Alam is not the same person, when he left the house, when he was a young boy. And now when he has come back, he's changed. So he's a different person. But in many ways, he's also the same. So the more he has changed, the more he has remained the same. So it is a story which is extremely complicated in its narrative mode. It uses a kind of to and fro method of narrating the story. So there is one linear narrative, and then there is a kind of constantly going back into the past, because the story is narrated through Alam. Alam narrates the story. We see the story, we understand the story through Alam's eyes. So Alam is the narrator. So it is Alam's understanding of his own past. It is Alam's understanding of his history, of his belonging, of who he is, and his relationship to this house and to Calcutta. This relationship is not something that he can negate. Now that he's a citizen of another country, he's now a Bangladeshi citizen. He cannot negate his other relationship with the city of Calcutta. So the space of Calcutta and Dhaka are also mirroring each other in a very interesting way in the city, in the story. Okay. So it's almost 8. I'm going to now briefly talk about Manik Bandyopadhyay, because I also want to hear some questions. So Manik Bandyopadhyay's story, the final solution, is of course a story which is talking about a history which we are not very familiar with, that is the gendered history of the partition. And we understand that it is about, of course, it is about space again, but it is also about another theme is introduced. Like in Alam and Nizet Bari, you have the theme of memory and time. In Toba Tek Singh, you had the theme of space and Batwara. But in Manik Bandyopadhyay, what you have is the idea of violence. And the woman's body becomes the site of this violence, which is enacted through the exile and the migration of the refugees from their homeland. So it's the woman's body which becomes the site, the space over which this violence is enacted. And the story is, of course, extremely, how shall I put it? It's a story which is quite remarkable, because you see here not a victim. Mollika is not a victim in the sense that we think of, when we think of partition violence, we think of victims. Mollika is both a victim and a perpetrator. And I think that's a very interesting way, and that's one of the reasons why I had chosen this story, to come into my collection, map making, is because in partition, you have this very ambiguous way in which people's agencies have been defined. So people whose houses got burned were also people who attacked people of another community. So the line between a victim and a perpetrator are very thin, and it's very fluid. And in Mollika's story, and it's a conventional story, it's with a linear narration, and we are constantly confronted with this question of violence. So if Mollika's agency is to defend herself, that agency is actually performed through violence. And it is performed through this complete fluidity of who is the victim and who is the perpetrator. So the whole power of the story comes from this blurring of lines between, what is happening to Mollika as a victim of the partition, as a victim of a history she does not understand. But it is also a story which talks about her use of violence, however justified or unjustified, whichever way you look at it, against a person who is going to rape her, molest her, and sell her as a prostitute. So the way in which the story actually unfolds, there is a very interesting movement in the story. So you begin the story with Mollika as the victim. She's helpless. She's in Shialda station. Her child is sick. Her child is hungry. Her husband is sick. She has a young sister-in-law. There are a huge amount of people who are just waiting to grab women in distress. So it begins as a kind of showcasing of this victimhood of women, but the narrative changes very quickly. And the narrative changes on this question of violence, because very soon, as the story ends, comes to an end, Mallika actually creates that moment where violence is used to make her earn her own freedom. So in a very interesting way, the story is very emblematic of the partition, because it is within partition and the events which unfolded in the partition, the blurring of lines between who were raping, who were being raped, who were molesting, who were being molested, who were committing arson, who was committing loot, all these blurring of activities created what a historian calls a moment of unprecedented and unprecedented violence. Let me finish my talk by reading this wonderful 2 lines from, by 2 historians. One of them is my Master Moshai, who edit this book on the 1940s and the beginnings of the partition years, and they say that the 1940s can be termed as, I quote, the best and the worst of times, occurring in crowded sequence, churning up catastrophe and exhilaration in equal measure, and ruthlessly compressing vast, unprecedented, indeed unimaginable changes in the urban landscape and demography within a span of little more than 10 years. Thank you very much. And let me stop here. I am happy to take any questions that you have.
Okay, so I will definitely share my observations and concluding remarks, but আপাতত আমি স্টুডেন্টদেরকে বলছি তোমাদের প্রশ্ন ইত্যাদি যা কিছু আছে সেটা করতে পারো।
And if you have specific questions on the stories, I'm happy to answer.
হ্যাঁ, এবং বাংলাতেও বলতে পারো, কোনো অসুবিধা নেই।
হ্যাঁ, বাংলাতেও বলতে পারো, আমার কোনো আপত্তি নেই। আমি ইংরেজিতে একটু সবসময় লেকচার করি বলে আমি ইংরেজিতে লেকচারটা দিলাম, বাট আই এম হ্যাপি টু আনসার ইউ ইন এনি ওয়ে আই ক্যান।
বলো দীপা, লিপিকা, রাজ, কোনো যদি প্রশ্ন থাকে।
না স্যার,
Hello,
কমপ্লিটলি বুঝে গেছি।
ওকে, হ্যাঁ দীপা কিছু বলছে। থ্যাংক ইউ রাজ। দীপা কিছু বলছে, বলো। আর দীপা একটু ক্যামটা অন করে নাও, ম্যাম যেহেতু রিকোয়েস্ট করেছেন। অসুবিধা হবে কি?
না স্যার।
তাহলে ক্যামটা অন করেই বলো।
Hello, ma'am. Good evening.
Hello,
sir. Ma'am, I think Sadat Hassan Wanto in his Toba texting has blended the and as well as psychological partition in very confused way, and it had left me a confusion. So I'd be thankful if you make it out to understand me the confusion between geographical partition.
হ্যাঁ দীপা, তোমার যে কনফিউশনটা মানে গল্পটা নিয়ে আছে, সেটা নিয়ে তোমার কি এখন একটু ক্ল্যারিটি এসেছে? তুমি কি এখন বুঝতে পারছো গল্পটা?
হ্যাঁ ম্যাম।
আচ্ছা
ম্যাম, এখানে জিওগ্রাফিক্যাল পার্টিশনটা আর সাইকোলজিক্যাল মানে তারা একটা ড্রামার মধ্যেও ছিল। ম্যাম, এই কনফিউশনটা একটু ডিস্টার্ব করছিল।
হ্যাঁ, কিন্তু এখন you want me to talk about it or you have understood from my lecture?
I would be thankful if a little bit.
Acha.
You
So basically you were confused because the story actually এটা দুটো স্তরে গল্পটা দুটো স্তরে এটা কাজ করছে। একটা স্তর হচ্ছে যে একটা পাগলখানা, তার মধ্যে যার লোকেরা আছে এবং তারা নানান রকমের পাগলামি করছে, দে আর সাপোজেডলি নট নর্মাল উইদিন কোটস। কিন্তু মানটো দেখাচ্ছে যে এই যাদেরকে আমরা অ্যাবনর্মাল বলছি তারা অ্যাকচুয়ালি আসল প্রশ্নগুলো করছে, যে প্রশ্নগুলো আমাদের অ্যাকচুয়ালি করা উচিত। তো এটা প্রথম স্তর। কিন্তু তার নিচে আরেকটা স্তর আছে গল্পটায়, যেটা হচ্ছে স্পেস বা স্থান। আর স্থানটা হচ্ছে যে সবসময় যে স্থানটা আমি দাঁড়িয়ে আছি সেইটা নয়, টোবাটেক সিং একটা পাগলা গারদে রয়েছে সেটাই একমাত্র স্থান নয়, ওর একটা মনে আরেকটা স্থান আছে যেটা ওর ফেলে আসা গ্রাম। বা যখন পাগলদেরকে এক্সচেঞ্জ করা হবে বিটুইন ইন্ডিয়া এন্ড পাকিস্তান, জানো এটা পার্টিশনের সময় এটা হয়েছিল যে ইন্ডিয়া থেকে মেয়েদের যারা অ্যাবডাক্টেড হয়েছে তাদেরকে পাকিস্তানে পাঠানো হবে, আর যে পাকিস্তানে হিন্দুরা অ্যাবডাক্টেড হয়েছে তাদের ফেরত পাঠাতে হবে। তো এই এক্সচেঞ্জ অফ পপুলেশনটা হয়েছিল। তো এই এক্সচেঞ্জের সময় ও ওই পাগলা গারদ ছেড়ে একটা নো ম্যানস ল্যান্ডে যাচ্ছে। গল্পের শেষে তো একটা জায়গায় ও গিয়ে দাঁড়ায় যেখানে ও বলছে যে আমি কোথাও যাব না, আমি হিন্দুস্তানেও যাব না, আমি পাকিস্তানেও যাব না। তো ওই স্পেসটা কি? ওই স্পেসটা হচ্ছে একটা লিমিনাল স্পেস, একটা স্পেস যেখানে হিন্দুস্তানও নেই পাকিস্তানও নেই। বুঝতে পেরেছো? Am I clear?
yes, ma'am. Absolutely.
Okay. Okay.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you so much, Deepa, for the question. আর কারো কোনো প্রশ্ন থাকলে
Raj was going to ask something.
না, রাজ মানে এটাই বলছি, তুমি বলে নাও রাজ, বলে নাও। আর ক্যাম অন করে বলা যাবে কি?
হ্যাঁ স্যার।
হ্যাঁ
হ্যাঁ ম্যাম, একটা কোশ্চেন ম্যাম, এটা বুঝে গেছি সম্পূর্ণ, আমি আন্ডারস্ট্যান্ড ফুললি, কিন্তু ম্যাম একটা আলাদা কোশ্চেন জিজ্ঞেস করতে পারি আমি?
নিশ্চয়ই।
ম্যাম ওই যে পিছনে ওই ব্যাকগ্রাউন্ডের ছবিটা আছে, ওটা আমি জাস্ট বুঝতে পারছি না কিসের আছে।
ওই ছবিটা এখন এক্সপ্লেন করতে গেলে আমাকে অনেক কথা বলতে হবে, বাট ছবিটা হচ্ছে একজন গ্রাহাম হেউড বলে একজন আর্টিস্টের আঁকা। ওই প্রথম ওপরের শাড়িটাতে কতগুলো মানুষের মুখ, বাট ওই মুখগুলো যখন তুমি নিচে যাচ্ছ ওগুলো চেঞ্জ হচ্ছে ইন রেস, ইন জেন্ডার। তো মানে মেয়ে ছেলে হয়ে যাচ্ছে, ছেলে মেয়ে হয়ে যাচ্ছে, একজন কৃষ্ণাঙ্গ লোক সাদা চামড়া হয়ে যাচ্ছে। এটার বক্তব্য হচ্ছে যে আমাদের সব বাইরের যে আমাদের মুখের যে চেহারাটা, ওই চেহারাটা আমাদের আসল চেহারা নয়। আমাদের আসল চেহারাটা হচ্ছে আমরা ভেতরে সবাই মানুষ।
ইয়েস ম্যাম, ওটাই জাস্ট একটু মাথায় করছিল।
হ্যাঁ, এই ছবিটা দেখে সব বাচ্চারা ভীষণ ভয় পায়। আমার যখন কোভিড এর সময় আমি সবাই ক্লাস নিতাম, আমার বাচ্চারা ভীষণ ভয় পেত, বলতো কি একটা ভয়ঙ্কর একটা সব মুখোশ মতন জিনিস। বাট ইটস অ্যাকচুয়ালি এ ভেরি নাইস প্রিন্ট, তুমি সামনে থেকে দেখলে বুঝতে পারবে।
থ্যাংক ইউ।
আমি শুধু এইটুকু অ্যাড করব যে মানে we are always proud of all our batches, and this particular batch has some very inquisitive minds, and Raj, Deepa, Lipika, Taiba, they are all those inquisitive minds. বাকি যারা আছে তারাও আগ্রহী, কিন্তু ওরা খুব সুন্দর প্রশ্ন করে। এবং I must add something on Raj specifically. He has a very good eye for photographs.
Oh yes, he noticed it. He noticed my background.
He does photography and editing himself. তো খুব সুন্দর নোটিস করেছো রাজ, ভেরি গুড। আর কেউ কোনো প্রশ্ন করবে? লিপিকা বা সৌরভ যারা আছো। লিপিকা, তুমি
বলো।
Good evening, ma'am.
হ্যাঁ,
লিপিকা ক্যামটা কি অন করা যাবে?
Yes, sir.
হ্যাঁ, প্লিজ।
Ma'am, I have a question.
হ্যাঁ বলো।
In the story, the final solution.
হ্যাঁ
Ma'am, here Mallika says that I have found a way out. Thakurji, the final solution. Ma'am, can you say something about this line?
এটা না ফাইনাল সলিউশনটা একটা শব্দ যেটা হিটলার ব্যবহার করেছিল against when he was killing the Jews in the Second World War. এই শব্দটা একটা এক্সটারমিনেশন, মানে একটা পুরো সংখ্যার মানুষকে শেষ করে দেওয়া। তো এই শব্দটা যিনি ট্রান্সলেটর, তিনি এই শব্দটা ব্যবহার করেছেন দ্য ফাইনাল সলিউশন। এটা আমি এটাতে একমত নই, কারণ এই হিস্টোরিক্যাল সিচুয়েশনটা, আমাদের পার্টিশনের সিচুয়েশনটা ঐতিহাসিকভাবে তো সেকেন্ড ওয়ার্ল্ড ওয়ার এবং জিউইশ কোয়েশ্চেনের থেকে ডিফারেন্ট। তো আর তুমি যদি বাংলায় দেখো, বাংলায় কথাটা হচ্ছে উপায়, the way. So it is not the final solution. Kintu jehetu because it has been used by the translator, etar maneta hocche je o এটা বলতে চাইছে যে এই সময় এই মুহূর্তে দাঁড়িয়ে ওর যে ওকে যে পরিস্থিতিটার সম্মুখীন হতে হচ্ছে, সেটার থেকে একমাত্র সলিউশন, একমাত্র উপায় যেটা ওর কাছে আছে সেটা হচ্ছে যে ওর নিজের হাতে ছুরিটা তুলে নেওয়া। আমি যে কথাটা বললাম যে ভিকটিম এবং যে আততায়ী, তাদের আইডেন্টিটিটা না এক হয়ে যাচ্ছে। এই গল্পটার মধ্যে এই অ্যাম্বিগুইটির বাংলাটা একটু বলো না ভাই দেবাদিত্য।
অ্যাম্বিগুইটি, আমিও বেশ ঝামেলায় পড়লাম। দর্থ বললে তো কিছুটা, মানে দর্থবোধক বললে বোধহয় কিছুটা কাছে।
মানে একই সঙ্গে মল্লিকা হচ্ছে সাফারার, ও পার্টিশনের সাফারার, বাট she is also the agent who will change things. বুঝতে পেরেছো লিপিকা? এটা ক্লিয়ার তোমার কাছে?
Yes, ma'am. Thank you, ma'am, for this.
ওই সলিউশন কথাটা হচ্ছে দ্য ফাইনাল সলিউশন, এখানে ওই ক্ষেত্রে ব্যবহার হয়েছে যে ওর সামনে উপায় কি? ওর সামনে উপায় হচ্ছে যে ও শিয়ালদা স্টেশনেই থাকবে, আদারওয়াইজ ওর উপায়টা হচ্ছে শিয়ালদা স্টেশন থেকে বেরিয়ে ওকে নিজের জীবনটা ওকে নিজের হাতে নিতে হবে, এবং সেই নেওয়াটার মধ্যে হচ্ছে একটা ভায়োলেন্স কাজ করছে। এই ভায়োলেন্সটা কিন্তু ওর নিজে তৈরি করেনি, এই ভায়োলেন্সটা ওর পারিপার্শ্বিক জগৎটা ওকে শিখিয়েছে। বুঝতে পেরেছো? তো গল্পটার মধ্যে নারী চরিত্রটি শুধু নারী চরিত্র হিসেবে নেই, নারী চরিত্রটি একজন এজেন্ট হিসেবে কাজ করছে। She is in charge of her own life. বুঝতে পেরেছো?
Yes, ma'am. Thank you.
আচ্ছা,
বেশ। আচ্ছা, দীপা has raised her hand. বলো দীপা, বলো।
Ma'am, once you told that in your times you used to discuss these things like about partition inside of the house, but কোথাও না কোথাও গিয়ে আমার মনে হয় যে এখনো হয়তো আমরা একটু ইতস্ততা বোধ করি মানে সবার সাথে ডিসকাস করার জন্য। আর আমাদের এবার ডিসার্টেশন রয়েছে, তো ভাবছিলাম যে এটা নিয়ে করা যেতে পারে, ব্যাপারটা কতটা সেফ হবে বা কিছু।
না কেন নয়, তুমি ইউ ক্যান অলওয়েজ টক অ্যাবাউট, তুমি উর্বশী বুটালিয়ার বইটা পড়ো, কারণ ওর মধ্যে এই সাইলেন্সিং এর ব্যাপারটা খুব ভালো করে এক্সপ্লেন করা আছে। এই সাইলেন্সিংটা যে সবসময় আমাদের রাষ্ট্র করছে তা নয়। এই সাইলেন্সিংটা কিন্তু আমরা নিজেরাই নিজেদের সেন্সরশিপ করি। এই যে তুমি বললে না, অনেক সময় আমরা নিজেরাই কথা বলতে ভয় পাই। এই সেন্সরশিপটা, এই যে আমাদের নিজেদের কথা বলার সুযোগটা আমরা নিজেরাই বন্ধ করে দিই, এটা কিন্তু সবসময় রাষ্ট্র করছে তা নয়। এটা সমাজ ও আমাদেরকে শিখিয়েছে যে এগুলো নিয়ে কথা বলার কি আছে, এগুলো তো অনেক আগে হয়ে গেছে, এগুলো নিয়ে কথা বলার কোনো দরকার নেই। বুঝতে পেরেছো? তো I think it's a very good idea. You can talk a little bit about how, as a person, as a young person, how do you see, how do you respond to this silence? কারণ পার্টিশনের যে এরিয়াটা, যে পড়াশোনাটা আমরা সবাই মিলে করছি, সেই পার্টিশন স্টাডিজে কিন্তু এখনো অনেক জিনিস আছে যেটা নিয়ে আমরা কথা বলি না। যেরকম ফর ইনস্টেন্স, আমি একটা ছোট উদাহরণ দিচ্ছি। আমাদের উত্তর পূর্ব ভারতে পার্টিশনের যে প্রভাব পড়েছে সেটা নিয়ে আমরা এখনো কথা বলি না। আমরা আসাম নিয়ে এখনো কথা বলি না। আসামে তো দুটো পার্টিশন হয়েছে। আমরা ত্রিপুরা নিয়ে কথা বলি না, বা আমরা বর্ডার নিয়ে কথা বলি না। তো এখানে অনেক রকম জিনিস আছে যেগুলো নিয়ে আমরা কথা বলি না, বা আমাদের রাষ্ট্র হয়তো আমাদের শিখিয়েছে যেগুলো নিয়ে কথা বলা যাবে না। So, there are many ways in which these silences continue. And I think it is very important for young people, students and academics and scholars to actually, আমাদের কাজই হচ্ছে এসব নিয়ে কথা বলা যেগুলো অন্য লোকেরা বলবে না, আমরা বলবো। এটা হচ্ছে আমাদের কাজ। And as a student, you have every right to be curious about these questions, right? I think it'll be a very good dissertation topic. You should go ahead.
Yes, Deepa, I also agree, and both me and Masood sir can assure you, if the dissertation is done properly, there is no reason to worry.
হ্যাঁ, কাজটা ভালো করে করো, ব্যাস। তারপরে কে কি বললো এটা এক কান দিয়ে ঢুকিয়ে অন্য কান দিয়ে।
Absolutely. So, আর কারো কি কোনো প্রশ্ন রয়েছে? বেশ, আমি ধরে নিচ্ছি আর কারো কোনো প্রশ্ন নেই। I will now move to the concluding remarks. আমার একটা খুব সুবিধে হয়, I kind of consider this a huge advantage for me. That is, I always keep going back to the days when I had the liberty to be a student. I mean, when was hosting all these sessions. Probably you people, the students here, you probably think that being a student, quote unquote, sucks. But trust me, when you enter the latter phase of your life, you will probably think about that differently. And I was actually just in the same position as you people. I was literally doing the class with you people. And I must say that, it's not easy for a person who happens to be one of those persons who gave partition studies, making of syllabi on partition literature a significant direction, to speak so simply. And Debjani Di just was doing that for so long, for more than 1 hour with us. I mean, I could see many areas that she very gently and very lucidly touched upon, but did not actually bombard you with jargons and too many names. But
বেশি জার্গন হলে তো আবার মুশকিল, বাচ্চারা কিছুই বুঝতে পারবে না, মাথার উপর দিয়ে চলে যাবে।
She just kindly acted almost like a storyteller, helping you go through these wonderful stories. And it was actually a special moment for our department and maybe University of Gourbongo by extension, because I can share this little bit of experience that I had as a part of the syllabus drafting committee for this particular paper. That is, when we were, searching for texts, when we were thinking which particular texts should we include, there emerged a book edited by, well, I did not know her back then, there some Debjani Sengupta, and we were all surprised to see the kind of range in the book. She so kindly included so many different voices, so many different writers trying to approach partition from so many perspectives. So technically it was, one of the significant contributors to the drafting of this paper itself in an indirect manner, sharing her insights with us. So I think this talk will have some significant value when it will be archived. And I cannot really thank Debjani enough. And I personally thank her in particular because she spoke at length about my personal favorite from the syllabus, that is Alam's Own House. Well, the reader, the connector in me can't resist but making this comment on the story that, I feel that the encounter with Raqqa, the encounter with the house, the encounter with Kolkata somehow tries to give us a very interesting idea that it's not just four walls that give us that homely feeling. At times, there are persons that give us the feeling of a home. At times, there is a whole city that gives us the feeling of a home. And I don't know if this person had any memory of partition at all at the back of his mind, but I can't resist quoting a very recent song by Anurag Saikia, which was sung so wonderfully by Rekha Bharadwaj. The lines go like this: अक्सर तुमसे मिलके मुझको घर सा लगता है, फिर क्यों दिल ही दिल में कोई डर सा लगता है. So probably we all experience a lot of emotions while reading this particular paper. I do, and I'm sure you people will also be doing experiencing emotions, memories, and Debjani very kindly guided us through that and also mentioned the theoretical nitty-gritties like how recently the memory studies or trauma theory is becoming very significant for the study of partition. I think we will be able to do something on studying partition on a larger scale in future. But for the time being, Debjani, thank you so much for spending time with our students. And
thank you, Debaditto, for very generous introduction and extremely generous, words of praise. I have not done anything sensational, but Deepa, I think, has another.
Deepa, কিছু বলতে চায়, বলো.
Deepa, please go ahead.
Please go ahead.
Sorry for again for interrupting.
No, it's fine.
No, bolo.
Actually, I want to thank ma'am because it was a very wonderful meeting. I think it would be more grateful for us if there would be not such limited times like this, as well as in our life also. It was very helpful as in partition literature. I would be thankful very in our life also if there were not such limited times.
No, I hope to come to Manikchok one day, and meet all of you, hopefully, or maybe not so near in the future. Tomra to ekhon pass kore beriye jabe, but it is always a pleasure to meet students, even if it is a virtual meeting. But I'm very glad and thankful that you could understand and take something from what I was saying. Debaditya, thank you very much for calling me, and I really enjoyed myself. Master Mashaider আর কি চাই? Master Mashaider তো আর কিছু চাই না, একটা spellbound audience, ব্যাস।
একদম। And these few people present here, they are very, very dedicated listeners, and I think they will do very good things in future, both as an academic and
my best wishes to all of you.
So with that, I think we should close the session, and
good night, Shubha Ratri.